Hi, we're going to talk about linear perspective, and the first thing I want to do is put it in the context of other things that artists have done down the centuries and millennia to give the feeling of illusionistic three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. So let's look at this beautiful Tahaku Sumi painting to start with here. When I ask my students what they see when they look at this, they typically say trees. And when I ask them to unpack that a little more, they'll say that some of the trees are behind the others. Some of them feel like they're further away because they're a little bit mistier. When we really start talking about what the visual clues are that make them feel that some trees are behind the other, which they're clearly not, right? They're all painted on a panel. They talk about the change in the value, so that these trees that seem to be in front here are darker than the trees that maybe seem to be a little bit behind them. They'll talk about the change in the amount of detail so that we see more information about these two trees that seem a little closer in front, and the ones that are a little further behind seem a little bit foggier and as if they're painted more quickly with less detail. They'll talk sometimes about the height on the page, so that the ones in general that are lower here seem closer. The ones that are higher up here, especially if they're a little bit smaller, they seem further away, right? And then, of course, usually takes me a while to get anybody to even notice this because it's so obvious. But the trees overlap each other, right? And the ones that overlap and are not concealed by anything else seem to be closer, just as we tell in real life when something's further away. If things are below our eye level, they look a little higher on our picture plane when they're further away. They look smaller, clearly, and they will be concealed by things that are in front of them if they're further away. So these are all principles that you may already know without even knowing them, right? In the East, in Japan, we're going to look at here a Japanese woodblock print way up until the 19th century. The principles of linear perspective did not really take hold in that very isolated culture. And yet, there was a lot of depth in Japanese art, and you can see that here. We can clearly tell that this person here, she may be a child, right? The fact that she's smaller than this person here doesn't necessarily make her look like she's behind, but the fact that she's overlapped definitely makes her look behind, right? The fact that these two people are a little bit higher, a little bit further from the bottom of the page, of the rectangle, makes them look further back than, say, this person here in the blue kimono, right? And we see these angles coming from the near edge of these rectangular solids, and those angles too tell us that things are getting a little higher on the picture plane as they go back into space. So those things just in and of themselves, the angles, the overlapping, the height on the page, are very, very powerful clues that some of these things are in front of the others and some of them are further away from us. We call this isometric perspective. So isometric, the iso in isometric means same, and the metric means measure. Isometric uses the fact that we see these angles on the floor when we look at lines receding from our picture plane. Isometric perspective respects the dimensions of things as they go back, however, and it doesn't make them smaller, or at least it doesn't make them smaller consistently as they go back into space. And when you think about it, that makes this a very logical and useful way of drawing things, especially for architects and engineers and people who care about measurements and dimensions. If you're doing a kitchen remodel, you might like to know that the back of the wall and the front of the wall are in the same scale, right? Because in real life, they will be the same size. So for centuries, artists, especially in Europe, who were really beginning to concern themselves with the depiction of illusionistic three-dimensional space, we'll say, understood these basic principles of overlapping height and a slight understanding of the size change as people went back into space or as objects went back into space. But because artists didn't have a system for regularizing that and controlling it, they used these principles in fairly personal and somewhat eccentric ways. So you'll see here in this beautiful Martini painting of Christ carrying the cross that it's a little hard to tell exactly how far Christ is out of this city, because the people here seem just exactly the same size he is, which makes him even feel bigger than him to us. We're used to a more regular recession as things go back into space. The city, on the other hand, looks quite small, right? So there's a little bit of an anomaly between the size of the people and the size of the town. Giotto, a painter from the same time period as Martini, in fact, you'll see that this painting was done about, 15 years earlier, also predates the discovery of linear perspective, or I should say the codification of linear perspective. He, however, had such amazing drawing skills that his paintings gave people, even in that time, a really, really convincing feeling of real space. And you'll notice here, as he overlaps these figures, they start to disappear, right? And that's what happens. That's what really happens when you see people in a crowd. They don't stay the same size as they overlap each other and go back into space. They get smaller, and so they tend to conceal each other as they go back into space. I'm sure, because Giotto was famous for his life drawing, I'm sure that he discovered this simply by observing and practicing drawing. You'll notice that in Giotto, there's a strong feeling of light coming from above here. So he was beginning, for the first time, really to render the idea of light falling on drapery and a feeling of light and shade. You'll also notice, if you look up here at these wild little angels who are lamenting in the sky, that they are drawn in very, very strikingly foreshortened positions. He must have had models lie down on tables, right, and take these poses in order to get these positions. He may have had to draw them from beneath on the floor, lying on the floor himself. This is Giotto showing off. These are among the very first drawings that we have of the human figure in foreshortened poses. The moral of showing you this Giotto painting is that if you have excellent drawing skills, you really don't need linear perspective. I'd like you to develop excellent drawing skills, of course. Masaccio had excellent drawing skills. He also was one of the inventors of linear perspective, though, and if it was good enough for him, it's probably good enough for us to learn it too. This is one of the first paintings, very likely the very first painting ever created using a deliberate vanishing point. The story is that these vanishing points were discovered by folks like Masaccio and I believe Donatello, who was a wonderful sculptor and architect of that same time period in Florence, Italy. They began doing drawings on panes of glass set up in front of their scenes or models, and they noticed when they drew right over the pane of glass that if they followed lines along parallel lines that receded from that pane, that they would always appear to come together at a vanishing point. If you follow the vanishing points in this coffered ceiling, which is where Masaccio used his perspective in this drawing, this is part of the painting, I should say. It's not part of the architecture. If you follow these lines down to the bottom of the pediment here that is depicted, you'll see a little nail hole in the plaster. And that is where Masaccio drove the nail that he used to snap the chalk lines and draw this architecture in perspective. Piero della Francesca, another famous painter of that era. This is a little bit later, but Piero again was a highly skilled draftsman and a great proponent of this new science of perspective that had just been invented in Florence. Here in this picture, there's not much in the way of linear perspective, but there are some wonderful foreshortened figures here, which again was a real acid test of your drawing skill in those days. In fact, this figure here is traditionally considered to be a self-portrait. It's interesting that he portrayed himself, if that is true, as one of the bad guys in this picture, the Roman guards who fell asleep and let Jesus get away with the resurrection. This painting, The Ideal City, this is in one-point perspective, although of course the building in the center uses ellipses and is kind of out of that one-point perspective system. This was originally attributed to Piero, and it's been attributed to several other people since then as art historians changed their mind, but whoever painted it, it's quite a stunner. Raphael, one of the great painters of the High Renaissance, painted this in the Vatican. It is also a fresco in the early 1500s, 1510. The red lines, of course, are not in the original painting, but these demonstrate that we can find the vanishing point in any perspective drawing or painting simply by following those parallel lines of recession. And in this case, they meet right in the very, very center of the work. Here is a painting of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, in Vatican City, rather. This one is a little bit more complex in terms of its perspective because the vanishing point is not quite in the center, but is over here to the left of center. The artist gets to decide where he or she puts her eye level and her vanishing point in a painting, right? Panini chose to put his vanishing point a little bit off to the left, probably to avoid a dead symmetrical composition. You'll also notice that the vanishing point, and it's easy to find it because you simply follow all these lines here until you get to it, and it looks like it's actually right about there. The vanishing point is way above the heads of all the people. So that means that the artist's eye level was considerably higher than those people that he depicted. He's looking down on them, maybe from the top of a set of stairs at the far end of the room, or maybe he's been suspended from the ceiling, or maybe he's simply using his imagination to give us this kind of aerial view of the basilica. Jean Perrault, this is a painting from quite a bit later, late 1800s. Lovely little painting of a Parisian cafe, and this is a fine example of two-point perspective. The complicated mirroring and remirroring makes the perspective even more fun, but you can see it very simply on the floor here. Some of these lines are receding to a vanishing point on the right, and some of them are receding to a vanishing point on the left, and they're receding up to eye level from the floor and down to eye level from the ceiling, right? This Edward Hopper is another nice example of two-point perspective. You might want to take a look at these when you're doing your two-point work, and I will leave it to you to see if you can identify where the vanishing points are. Hint, they're quite a ways off the canvas, and where the eye level line is. This is an example of something that the Renaissance artists would never have done. This is three-point perspective. And you'll see if you look especially at the windows on this skyscraper here, that there are vanishing points on the left way below the bottom of the picture, and on the right, again way below the bottom of the picture. And there is a third vanishing point way up at the top of the picture, possibly a little bit off the top. I'm going to say it's right actually about at the top of the picture here, right, if we follow these lines up. That third vanishing point gives us the feeling that we are maybe possibly in a building right next door to this, or maybe we're actually washing the windows on this very building and we're looking very, very steeply up at it. So in order to see these vanishing points controlling and making these lines converge down at the bottom here, that's where our eye level is. And in order to see these lines here, we have to actually turn our head. I shouldn't say turn our head. We have to actually tip our head up to get the feeling that we are looking up towards the sky. And that feeling of kind of more than one eye level, the eye level that you would get if you were washing the windows in the building and the eye level that you would get if you looked up at the top, is that would have been a little too dizzying for your typical Renaissance artist. Here's three-point perspective. Of course, now we're looking down. And this is a very fun thing to try. One nice thing about three-point perspective is that it avoids almost any lines that are parallel to the edges of the picture. And although an artist like Piero della Francesca would have loved making lines that are parallel to the picture, because Renaissance artists tended to value a very, very stable sort of composition. 21st century artists tend to value things that are a little bit more dynamic, and diagonals, of course, are much more dynamic and give a feeling of energy and space that can be very, very powerful. This is used, of course, all the time in illustration and animation. And three-point perspective, although we're not going to do exercises in it in this beginner class, I can't resist showing it to you because I think you'll want to try it on your own, and it's so much fun. So, quick trip through art history and looking at efforts that artists have always made to show space. Please remember that you will never outgrow overlapping. Overlapping, just as this gentleman here is overlapping these buildings and seeming to be very, very close to us, overlapping is probably the single most powerful technique we have to show space. So as you get involved with all sorts of vanishing points and everything, please don't forget about the simple stuff too. Have fun!